All right, so a little bit about my background at the Aviation Training Center in Mobile. I'm a fleet-wide standardization pilot. That's an ATP in multi-engine airplanes, commercial airplanes, single-engine land, and rotorcraft. I'm part of the team that's developing the Advanced Instrument Refresher course, which will be a week-long program that kind of mirrors the Air Force's Advanced Instrument School. The severe weather curriculum developer is why I've been in contact with the folks at the National Weather Service. I've also developed the Coast Guard's upset prevention and recovery training program, which is required for Part 121, and I highly encourage it for all aviators to take time to learn to do that. Crew resource management instructor, previously a fixed and rotary wing flight safety officer, and then in the Army, I was a rotary wing maintenance company commander and a fixed wing military intel OIC. So I've gotten a peek behind a lot of curtains. I won't tell you I'm an expert in any one of them, but I have learned enough to know that I don't know enough. I've also been qualified in the HC-144, which is what I currently fly, a fixed-wing twin turboprop for the Coast Guard, the H-60, and the C-12 and an OH-58. So again, first and foremost, thank you all. Thanks, Phil, for putting this together. John, and Michael at the Mobile National Weather Office, who have been mentors and supporting us in our initiatives, and Jason, who's not here as well. And then thanks for everything that you do in the industry as meteorologists, as NTSB, as FAA, as general aviation pilots, as military aviators. Thank you. So I'm not going to sit up here and talk about science because most of you are degreed meteorologists and I would embarrass the crap out of myself. But what I do want to focus on is the lane that I have a tremendous amount of background and emphasis on, and that's the people. So in the next few minutes, I kind of want to share my motivations for why I decided to try to become more weather-wise. I want to explore weather decision-making philosophy from the idea or the perspective of a pilot. I want to be weather king for a day, which is, now that I understand what king for a day actually means, probably not the greatest thing to be. And then suggest ways for all of us to teach weather better when we have an opportunity. So why I care more than I used to about weather. These are the elements at play in every single ground or air operation. There are a lot better models out there that really detail it, but as a pilot, I care about quickly conveying practical information. And this is it. There's the human, the machine, and the environment. Historically, and even currently, the entire aviation industry is really focused on teaching you the machine. What airspeeds do I have to fly? How do I do an instrument procedure approach? What are the rules for ceilings and visibility, but not necessarily the science behind it. Unfortunately, the human and environment are what constitutes 80% of most mishaps. I mean, the aircraft today are pretty dang good. So what we need to do is continue to emphasize the machine, but bring the human and environment into focus. So today we'll talk specifically about the environment, and this is kind of a short list. The most important two things that I want to hit are weather and culture, because they go hand in hand. So to do that, I'm going to segue just a moment here to help illustrate a point. And this is the F-22. I've never flown it. I don't know much about it except for the pilots that I talked to who have flown it will tell you it's absolutely incredible. A quick little Google search that I did tells you that it produces 40,000 pounds of thrust per engine. It's capable of super cruising, that means past the speed of sound, without the use of its afterburners. It's the second most powerful jet fighter in the world, only second to the F-35 because that's a more current design. So how do we fail at the intersection of the human, machine, and environment? Well, we take an F-22, and on takeoff, we have a gear-up accident. That's right, on takeoff. I think we're all familiar with landing gear-up and that concept, but two pilots, not fully understanding how they intersected with the human, machine, and environment, were able to crash military-grade aircraft with full afterburner capability because they didn't know what was going on. So the point I'm trying to make here is that even with the best and most powerful aircraft, we can put the aircraft in a position it can't recover from. So a little personal story here. The first one, here I am, a little 210-hour fixed-wing military aviator in Afghanistan. And I'm flying from Kandahar to Bagram. Bagram is a little airport up in the north that's surrounded by mountains, right? And at the time, brand new aviator, just out of flight school, right over there. And when we get a weather briefing in the military, we have to have the initials of the person who briefed us. It's kind of like the proof that things happen. Well, this weather forecaster on this day, after a briefing, we said, "Sir, I'm not going to give you my initials." I said, "Well, why not?" Because I don't think you should go. So, oh, okay, I understand. I really appreciate that, but my pilot and commander over here is telling me we got to go. So he gets on the phone. There's a conversation. He talks to her supervisor. We finally get the initials to go, and we fly happily over to Bagram. Now, what I'm going to point out to you here, because it's really difficult to see, is this is my aircraft. This is the 5-mile ring, so directly in front of us, you can see the beginning of magenta, certainly red, yellow, and green. We stayed in what retrospectively I now understand to be a level 5 or 6 thunderstorm for about 15 minutes, stacked surface to infinity. Because when it actually settled over Bagram, every aircraft that was trying to recover had no other way to go. So we were stacked 500 feet separation, which is well below what's required in the national airspace in America. 500 feet separation in updrafts and downdrafts that were so significant. We had TCAS resolutions from the aircraft being pushed up below us and above us coming down, all while we're orbiting in this very small little box because there was nothing else for us to do. So we stayed there for about 15 minutes before we finally broke out and landed, and I will tell you, that was the day I thought, maybe I don't want to be a pilot, because this was so unfun that it's the only time in my life I wanted to close my eyes and let somebody else solve the problem for me. But that wasn't possible. So what I didn't know about convective weather before that could fill a book. But specifically, I didn't understand decibels of reflectivity. I didn't know it was a logarithmic scale. So I had no idea that the more the return was, the more intense the precip was on an order of magnitude larger. I didn't know what the colors correlated to. I didn't know anything about decibels of reflectivity and the storm hazards themselves. I didn't know reflectivity characteristics like big drops make large reflectivity, even if they're not that intense or any of that. And I had no idea about the VIP levels. You know, you heard Paul talk a lot about what the airplanes flew through. I had no idea what a level 1 through 6 was, and I had no access to the historical research that put that in context. Right now we hear light, moderate, heavy, and severe. Historically, it was 1 through 6, and that's how all the research was done back in the day. I think 2006 when we made that swim. I knew nothing about the use of airborne weather radar. I turned it on. I tried to stay away from red and magenta. I didn't understand tilts. I didn't understand look-ahead angles. I didn't understand blank ranges. I didn't understand top estimation. None of that, right? And I had no idea that not everything in the world behaved like an air mass thunderstorm in Alabama. That was it. That was my whole experience with Fort Rucker, Alabama. Every thunderstorm that I dealt with was, don't put your rotor tip in or your wing tip in and you're going to be fine. So let's flash forward about 30 more military fixed-wing hours, of which 5 were that storm I just showed you. And I'm going to bring up a picture here in a second, and it might not show, but I guarantee you everyone in this room is going to go, I can't believe you did that before you got it. Justin didn't know any better. So we're flying, and anytime you think something's weird enough to take your camera out, take a picture of it, is probably a clue that you don't want to go and do anything with that weather. So I'm flying, and an aircraft ahead of me just lands, and that's something I want you to keep in the back of your mind. An aircraft that just landed, and all of a sudden we start to see some dust blow towards the end of the runway. We go, oh, that's pretty weird. We call tower, like, hey, can we get a wind check? And they're like, straight down the pipe at like 7 knots. We're like, okay, we're seeing a lot of wind blow. They're like, yeah, we kind of see it too, but somebody just ahead of you just landed and they reported fine. All right. I don't know if you can make it out, but that is the regular ground, and this is the dust ring of a dry microburst. And honestly, I think a lot of people now kind of know it, but back in 2011, Justin's sitting there, and my aircraft commander is going, we got this, right? It was the textbook presentation of a microburst. We hit. I'm doing everything I can to try to get the aircraft to descend and slow down. Then all of a sudden, I'm getting pushed down harder than I possibly understand. And at that last moment, it rips all of the air out from me with that tailwind. We hit so hard that military aircraft have flares, which are used to kind of shoot out to destroy or distract heat-seeking missiles. We hit so hard that every flare on the side of my aircraft punched off and fought out the runway. So there was only one runway in Kandahar, and our aircraft fought it out entirely for like 30 minutes while they picked all that stuff up. We hit and bounced so many times that we didn't even have a chance to say what the F. We just kind of looked at each other, taxied off, shut down, and didn't talk about it for the rest of our, like, I still don't think that pilot and I have ever talked about it, right? So what I didn't know, but could have, was the risks of high base convective activity. I had no idea how temp dew point and the environmental lapse rate played into the how likely it is for you to have a microburst. I had no idea that you could have such a benign cloud structure for a microburst that we could fly in and think nothing about it at all. I didn't know there was such thing as a dry microburst dust signature. I had no idea how my aircraft would perform in the textbook presentation of a microburst. There was no, and still is no, wind shear escape procedure for that particular aircraft, which is disturbing. I didn't know that there was only one wind sensor on the airport, and it was located at the central place, so it didn't even know that there was a wind shift going on. And I had no idea that micro-scale events like this, what the problem is when you follow an aircraft in front of you with effective activity. Because generally speaking, if a pilot sees another pilot do it, we go, oh, I can probably do that, right? So these are things that at my piddly 240 hours, I didn't know. So here's what's more surprising, and I don't want to knock on it, right? I was flying with W4s both times, 15 to 20-year pilots that had a wealth of knowledge and experience. So what was surprising to me is that they didn't know any of the things that I didn't know. So these are my mentors, my 20-year pilots, who were sitting right next to me, and we're making these decisions in real time and going, yeah, I think we can do this, right? So if they didn't know it, there was no reason for someone like me to know it. But I'm sure some of you are thinking, I bet they covered some of that in flight school. And you'd be 100% right, because I've gone back and I've looked at the curriculum for both Army Flight School and Navy Flight School from weather to make sure it's kind of in there. And they do teach it, but I'm going to let you in on a secret. And don't be upset, meteorologists, but to a pilot in flight school, weather is not the most important topic, right? In fact, you even heard one of our military counterparts say that they had to repeat the exam. And you know what happened to him in his career? Nothing. He's still a very successful pilot, right? Weather is not emphasized routinely or consistently after flight school. And answer this question. I want you to work with a student pilot and get them to assess whether it's safe or not to take off in that thunderstorm, or I want you to determine whether or not they're holding their altitude and airspeed within 10 knots or 100 feet. Which one do you think is easier for an instructor pilot to go, yeah, you're pretty squared away, I think you're fine? I mean, very clearly, I can point to a standard and a checklist or anything like that and say, hey, you missed that. But it's a tough conversation, even amongst meteorologists, to go, I think that feature means that storm's going to do X, Y, or Z. And that's what they have degrees in. So let's take a look at some of the military weather training opportunities. It's just going to be a chart of in-depth, how in-depth we go into the topic, and then when we have an opportunity to do it. The blue will be the baseline, like the bare minimum, and kind of the dash will show you what is like sky's the limit. So flight school, there's only baseline. You don't go any deeper than is absolutely required to pass the test, right? So everybody should leave flight school with the same theoretical amount of knowledge. Now, I know in the civilian world this could vary greatly based off of who your CFI is, who the DPE is that does your kind of check ride, and then what you do thereafter. But in flight school, it's pretty prescribed that you'll do these things. Regulations and policy. All right, most regulations are designed to tell you what you absolutely must do. Now, local companies, local units, or local pilots or individual pilots might put in place their own personal minimums, and that'll raise it up a little bit, but that's not really training me. That's just telling me what I can't do. Okay, AOR, area of responsibility. At a bare minimum, if I'm stationed in Miami for 4 years and then I go to Mobile for 4 years, that's 8 years. That's 2 of my 4 flying tours where I might have basically the same kind of weather, maybe a little bit more sea fog and some other stuff. But generally speaking, I can have a very low exposure. Or I could be on the West Coast where thunderstorms don't exist at all, where there's no icing down in the coast, right? So you can see how, depending on where I'm stationed, I don't get exposed to very much. Or I could bounce around to a couple of different air stations or a couple of different units. I could go to fly-ins in places that I don't normally go to and kind of expand that scope, but that's not required. Let's look at informal training. This is kind of like your pilots come together from time to time and go, dude, on this last flight this happened to me, I can't believe it, or I read this article the other day, or we had this NTSB kind of speaker, but it's informal. There's really no quality control in it, and there's no emphasis or requirement. Well, formal training. The baseline is 0. There is nothing currently in the military for a pilot, except for NOAA or weather research that's on. There is no program you can go to say that I got trained to be a weatherwise aviator. The Air Force's Advanced Instrument School is 2 weeks long, and it was like 1 hour of weather that this is not a knock on them. I think they just went and cut like the 3 phases of a thunderstorm and put it on the slide, and they're like, everybody understand those? We don't like those. Are we all in agreement? Okay, let's move on. That's where I thought I'd get formal training, and it just didn't happen. So mishap analysis, this is where there's great variety as well. If I have NTSB meteorologists giving me some in-depth, I mean, I'm going to have a lot more out of that. But generally what happens, even as a flight safety officer, it was kind of like, well, there were thunderstorms and they avoided it. Okay, well, cool. What products did they have available to them? What was the decision-making involved at the time? Like, you can see how there's a lot of variation. Self-study, again, no baseline, right? So you can go all the way and get a PhD in meteorology if you were so inclined as a pilot. But generally speaking, nobody is pushing for that. Nobody's looking for that. Nobody even notices it. In fact, I annoy the shit out of the people I fly with, where all I talk about is, you see that cloud, let's talk about that. They're like, oh, God, we're with Justin. And then we have exposure and experience, right? So there's a high baseline. I mean, over a 15 or 20-year career, you're going to bump into some of these things. They're going to come up, right? But the problem with this is that it's significantly variable and it's highly dependent on time, which means you take 3 or 4 pilots in the same airframe, in the same unit, currently, and our backgrounds are so different that you can't just grab one of them and go, hey, I have a quick question for you. You've got to be like, all right, okay, so Jeff's really good at this, I'm going to ask him that, and she's really good at Key West, I'm going to ask her that, right? Like, we just don't have that consistency. And as we lose people to the airlines, we're losing that senior level kind of mentorship, right? Or just vendor retirement. It's not just the airlines, which, by the way, please write me letters of recommendation. So the problem here is that Coast Guard pilots, and this is what I'm speaking of currently, are the on-scene authority. Our regulations, our FAR equivalent, literally says, if you think you're going to save a life and it's necessary, throw this whole book away, right? Well, why is that a problem in the context of weather? Well, number one, we rarely have up-to-date products for real-time operations. And when I say real-time operations, I mean the takeoff I'm doing right now, the hoisting operation I'm doing right now, the decision to drop survivor gear to a survivor right now, not like the big kind of overall day, but like right now. Well, we aren't always operating at airports that have trained weather observers that can augment the data we have. We can very quickly leave ATC, ADSB, and flight service station coverage, particularly at the altitudes that we fly. While we regularly operate in areas that are not supported by U.S. government or even commercial weather services, we may be the only aircraft around for hundreds of miles, and I guarantee you, at 200 feet over the water where Zach hangs out, there's nobody else there. Probably the most important too. Even if we have all of the information available to us, the picture is still not always clear. Again, if I presented the same scenario to every meteorologist in this room, you'd come really close because you have that much experience, but there would still be room for conversation. So here's a perfect example of a case that I had to decide whether we were going to prosecute up in New England. It was, go check out, this thing. It doesn't matter the details, but can you go out here and look at this thing? And it's really, really important. Maybe, but what do we have right there? I know you can't see it, but that's a 37,000-foot thunderstorm top, followed by a next subsequent line of significantly high top thunderstorms, right? So that's like the question that we're giving a pilot who's never had any formal weather training at 2 a.m. and saying, I know that you really actually didn't even hear what I said because you're still sleepy, but you've got a 30-minute launch window, and if you don't go, somebody's going to die, which pretty much orients me around the idea of I want to go. So that leads us into weather decision-making philosophy. How do we as pilots decide, yeah, I want to do this or not? So when it comes to weather decisions, like, is it safe to land in this weather? This is what pilots want. We want to shake the magic 8-ball and get the absolute answer. And that's not the case. The best we're ever going to get is the magic 8-ball that says, yeah, signs point to yes. You'll probably be able to do it, but if you didn't, we'll also be able to point back and say, you shouldn't have done it because everything said that maybe it was bad. So just recognize that in the context of Coast Guard aviation, weather decisions come down to 3 things. Number one, I need pilots to take the weather cases that they should take because that's our job. We should be going out and trying to save lives. So I should know if this is a case I should take. Well, that means I should also know if this is a case I shouldn't take. And probably most importantly, I need to understand when one becomes the other. When is it the time to go when I shouldn't have? And when is it the time to stop when I started? So let's look at some elements of weather decision making. So there's two types of weather decisions. There's the tactical, which is that can I, and then there's that strategic, which is more of a should I. We'll explore this a little bit more later. So the four questions every pilot should be asking with regard to weather is, number one, where is it? Number two, what is it? Number three, what's it going to be when I get there, which is probably the most difficult for us to understand, and why latency and limitations of products and tasks being issued every 6 hours, all that stuff really comes into play. And then for us specifically, the fourth thing we have to consider is, where does this fall into our warranted risk? That's a framework for saying if you're going to save a life, you can destroy the aircraft, but you can't kill the crew. If you're going to, preserve property or relieve pain and suffering, you can do this much damage, whatnot. So this is like our basis point. So where does this fall into warranted risk? So all of that leads us to 6 choices. Before I take off, I can decide to go, I can delay a little bit longer, or I can decide that it's not appropriate for me to go. But as soon as I lift off, I only have 3 more options. I can continue the mission, I can abort the mission, or I can divert. I can go somewhere else. That's it. And if we hardwire into pilots that before you take off, these are your choices. In flight, these are your choices. It makes the language of decision making a little bit easier. So let's talk really briefly about weather decision-making culture. This would be a lecture in and of itself, but there's 2 real cultures that develop when we talk about individuals or organizations. The left is going to be outcome-based, the right's going to be behavior-based. So outcome-based are really going to be the default setting for any organization, and they tend to form unintentionally. That means, like, if you don't do anything, this is probably how your organization is going to be oriented. So it encourages risk-taking and competition, which in and of itself is not necessarily bad, particularly for Coast Guard aviators. We do need to take appropriate risks. It can foster an ends justify the means mindset, which is not something that we want to consider. But the thing to pay attention to is that in an outcome-based culture, Coast Guard units are likely to take more cases. We're likely to try more often. So if you're a survivor, you might want an outcome-based kind of culture. Well, what about behavior-based? So behavior-based is not ingrained into the military's kind of bias for action mindset. Like, we are trained, selected, oriented, encouraged, rewarded, promoted on the concept of getting the mission done. So this is not a default. It requires a lot of deliberate guidance, mentorship, and understanding. We have to take time as an organization, especially at the leadership levels, to explain why we supported a crew for doing what they did, or why we would have encouraged them to do something else. And that sometimes is difficult. And the trick here is that units likely prosecute the right cases. So if you are a survivor who then gets picked up on an aircraft on a case that shouldn't have been prosecuted, you're still in just as much risk as that crew that shouldn't have gone out in the first place. So neither of these by themselves are right or wrong. We just have to understand that if you're not deliberately setting the culture of your unit, you're probably going to find yourself in a place where ends justify the means. So how does weather affect us? If we're going to talk about the risk of weather to a pilot, we have to know what weather can actually do. And when I ask pilots this, generally I get one of 2 things. It decreases aircraft's performance. You're 100% correct, right? So it's going to reduce kind of our capabilities. Or I get, generally it just reduces our visibility. And that's also very correct. But the number one thing weather does to every pilot, whether there's hazards embedded in it or it's just reduction in ceiling visibility, is an increase in workload. That is the number one thing that pilots should aggressively pursue, is workload management. Because as soon as your workload increases, your triple-digit IQ goes to double digits. And if you're like me and it starts in the double digits, it goes to single digits. And it's just the way it is. So understand that no matter what the weather is, an increased workload is the number one impact. But then it also does these other terrible things to us. So a survey for the room. Do we think pilots intentionally take high risks? Even in the Coast Guard, do you think I just arbitrarily take a high risk? Probably not, right? So let's kind of explore that. This is a METAR, and I would like, particularly with meteorologists in the room, is there anything that really, yes, heavy rain and thunderstorms, but anything about that really jump out at you? From a Delta or a Southwest perspective, aircraft still probably taking off later than that. I'm not going to hold you to it, no legal obligation. No, because the thunderstorms are in the line. Okay, Cool. I'll tell you that we have taken off and landed in that quite frequently, and there is an airline involved in this. So this is 2 minutes before the aircraft in question attempted to land. Let's take a look at what that looked like from the ground. I can see the aircraft on final, right? You can tell, I mean, I've got a pretty visible horizon, but it's definitely getting bad. Well, what about 2 minutes after landing? Damn, that was a pretty significant shift, right? I can't even see the third aircraft in line at the gates now from this picture. Well, this was Air France 358. So again, not a U.S. air carrier in a few years ago. But how often have we seen METARs or surface observations change that quickly? Depending on when the storm's passing, it can happen quite frequently. So the key here is that pilots underestimated the risks associated with particular activities. They did not simply accept a high level of risk, and this is key. Further, as experience increases, the perceived level of risk associated with a given hazard decreases. Every time those pilots successfully beat a thunderstorm in before it hit the airport, it positively reinforced the fact that it's not that bad. It's not gotten me before. I bet I could squeak this one more out. So to understand why this matters more, we need to look at risk, and we'll focus it exclusively in the context of weather for today. So the Coast Guard looks at risk as the severity of the thing times the likelihood of the thing happening times how much exposure you have. And this is important because if I drop any one of these to 0 or near 0, the overall risk greatly reduces. So in the weather context, severity can be like how bad is the turbulence going to be, how bad the ice is going to be, how big is the hail size, how bad is the wind shear going to be. Probability kind of looks more like what's the probability of me having a microburst, what's the probability of it being freezing rain, what's the probability of me losing control in this particular turbulence, or structural damage, or mountain wave, or clear air, or runway explosions, right? What's the likelihood of this weather resulting in this outcome? And that's a very difficult question. And then exposure comes to, well, how far do I need to avoid this phenomenon? What altitude should I fly at? What escapes do I need to be kind of prepared for? What approach is best for me? You know, maybe I go the longer way around to get a runway that's more favorable as opposed to saving the 3 minutes. And then search action plans. How do we prosecute search cases? It's going to be based off of the exposure to the hazard. So let's take a look at exposure specifically in the context of my aircraft. So this is time that the 144 spins below 1,000 feet. That's relevant because low-level wind shear is about 2,000 feet and below. You talk about microburst escape capabilities. If I'm above 1,000 feet of obstacles, even in some of the worst microbursts, I'm probably going to have the horizontal distance to get out of it before I climb away. About 45 seconds in a takeoff, I'm below 1,000 feet. About a minute, almost 2 minutes, am I from like final approach fixed inbound below 1,000 feet, right? So if the hazard is wind shear or a thunderstorm or a microburst, I have a relatively small amount of exposure for that period of time. And that's not saying I encourage you to go out and go, oh, I got 45 seconds, I can get away with it. I'm just saying, in the context of exposure, that's what I have. Well, if I'm in a drop pattern at 200 feet with my ramp open, just like the aircraft is here, and I've got human beings right there ready to push survivor gear out, or Zach's hovering over a boat at 35 feet to do hoisting operations at night, and there's a cell downwind of him that hasn't yet produced kind of an outflow, well, his exposure and my exposure is the entire time that I'm in that profile. If I'm doing a search pattern, just the other night, I was at 500 feet in the vicinity of multiple thunderstorms for about an hour, right? So my exposure is significantly different, even though that hazard is the same. So this is relevant because it's the exact profile that we fly when we drop survival. So this was a U.S. Air Force National Guard a firefighting accident that took place in 2012. And I want to read you the part that really jumps out. So as the second drop was planned to occur less than 5 minutes after the first successful drop, it is highly probable that the mishap crew continued preparing for the second drop with the expectation that the operational condition would remain similar, despite the deteriorating weather conditions. So they were able to release fire suppressant, come back around, and do it again when they were hit by a microburst, right? So as a pilot, if I get away with it the first time and I'm under time pressure, I'm probably going to do the same thing again. And 5 minutes in convective environments is a lifetime. if the average thunderstorm builds at, and I'm surveying the room, what's the, 2,000 to 3,000 feet per minute, probably, a good garden variety storm, right? 3,000 feet per minute times 5 minutes is 15,000 feet, and that's after it's already reached the point that it's precipitating. That's about a 30,000 foot storm, right? So just recognize that 5 minutes of convective environment is a lifetime. And we saw that with the last mishap, with the latency in the data and the decision to try to turn somewhere else. So risk management is something that's deeply ingrained into the way Coast Guard does business, the way that all aviators think, even if they don't use the same language. Well, let's look at some flaws in it. So typically, it's flawed if we're using the best or worst case outcome, regardless of the actual likelihood. If John tells me that the likelihood for thunderstorm or microburst today is low, and I refuse to go drop to somebody because I'm like, well, it could still happen. It's kind of like when we hedge our bets with the prop 30 for the whole day, with the, whatever, right? At some point, we have to look at the actual data. Relying on bad, outdated, or incomplete information, I will tell you, I won't say bad, but outdated and incomplete information is where every Coast Guard search and rescue case begins. Bad data comes later, but we're always operating on late information. And weather information, as we've talked about, is typically late no matter what. Even unless you're getting it from like Power right that second. Giving all data equal weight regardless of the source. This is where when I was asking, will you adjust PIREPs based off of where you get them? PIREP interpretation is an art, right? I have to look at who said it, and actually the gentleman sitting right next to me we were talking about this. It was a severe turbulence in clear air at 3,000 feet today, just north of one of the Charlie Airport, which I interpret probably as wake turbulence because there was nothing else in the world going on and no other PIREPs. So to have a severe turbulence encounter at 3,000 feet with nothing else going on seems highly unlikely until you look at the fact that it's a Charlie Airport, so he probably flew into the wake of somebody else. But that's interpretation. I'll never know. Over-reliance on personal experience, which we'll talk a lot about here in a minute, and personal agendas. This is that get-home-itis. This is that do I want to go out there and try to save this person's life. And the more we understand weather and weather resources, the less likely these flaws can be to impact our decisions, right? So if I know these flaws exist, I can actively work to minimize how much they skew my perception. So the availability heuristic is a mental shortcut that we use. When you think how long it's going to take you to get to work today, that's a shortcut. Like probably about 15 minutes, 20 minutes. It's probably never 15 or 20 minutes, but it's close enough that you can use that for planning purposes. So it's also a way for us to answer really complex questions by asking a more simple question. And in this context, the complex question is, how safe is it to make this takeoff or this flight? Well, that's a pretty difficult question. But the easier question is, how often have I crashed in the past? All the information about weather hazards, what are we using to actually make those decisions? Well, we're using a much smaller pinch of the overall piece, right? So the information we use when we assess weather hazards is personal information, recent information. If I scared myself recently or the weather has been behaving a certain way recently, that's much more available in my working memory, so it's going to skew the way I perceive risk. Much the way that we were talking about how there's no fog in the middle of the summer, I'm not going to follow the model, right? Because in your mind, the availability of all the years you would work there said that this is probably not accurate, okay? And then extreme cases. If you're an NTSB accident investigator or you spend a lot of your career looking at mishaps, you have a lot of extreme examples of what can go wrong. And that's not necessarily statistically accurate, right? The thing I'm driving at here is that my experience is my reference point. And why that matters is that almost all decision-making research says that reference points is how we set, right? If 1003 is the reference point for IFR versus VFR, then a new pilot might go, oh, well, it's 1104, that's fine, right? Well, really, we want that to be much more like 3005, right? But that how we set our reference point is going to be how we make a lot of our decisions. Personal experience is one of the single greatest influencers on assessing the risk posed by weather. I saw this all the time with new pilots that came up to the Cape from Miami that had never flown an icing. The first time they had trace icing, they were like, we need to get out of this right this second. And then after a summer, they're like, a winter, they're like, oh, okay, all right, light icing, let's work to get out of it. And then by the time they're leaving, I'm like, dude, that's moderate icing. They're like, yeah, I know, I've seen it before. I'm like, we should be leaving the cloud now. So your personal experience is really what sets your reference point. Here's the big problem that we have as pilots. How many times have you been told to avoid all thunderstorms by 20 miles, right? Well, that's not always practical, but that is like the answer we're given, 10 to 20 miles, depending on who you ask. Well, we have violated these rules so many times that we start to lose confidence in them. But we have to remember that our experience is a sample size of 1. So my logbook is not a primary reference for weather. Everyone in this room who has meteorological experience is so much more educated on that hazard than I will ever be. And if they tell me that this is the way that we need to do business, then I need to respect the fact that I will never possess the knowledge and experience they do, no matter how many times I've gotten away with it in the past. All right, so here's some other human factors vulnerabilities that come into play. I would bore you to death with all the other studies, so I just took kind of the key highlights. A distorted perception of risk results from successful past experiences. This leads a lot of VFR into IMC accidents. Okay, I got away with flying this before. I landed just in time. I don't need to set personal minutes. Next thing you know, you have trained crews, multi-crewed aircraft with instrumentation and autopilots flying themselves into the ground or the water because they just didn't have that much respect for what was going on at the time, or awareness. So the intrinsic rewards of not executing a missed approach may reinforce the insidious move towards less conservative judgment. Everyone says go-arounds are free, except for the airlines, right? A go-around's not free. They know exactly how much money it's going to cost. And if I'm doing a medevac for a patient, I know exactly how many minutes I've lost in that. And if you're running your own Hobbs meter, you know exactly how much you're paying for it. So we say go-arounds are free, but we really don't enforce them. And there's a lot of research about this that says that we just kind of violate that. We fly unstable approaches to a landing all the time. And, well, as a result, we just don't, did it all pop up? Sorry. We just don't realize that we're getting less conservative over time. It's like the frog in the frying pan. You put them in there and it's hot, they'll jump right out. You put them in and you warm it up, they'll stay there and cook. So comprehension of low probabilities is something we're simply not good at, right? It's so difficult for us to understand what the actual likelihood is of a mishap that we kind of just go, it's probably going to be okay today. And then this is a big one for the Coast Guard. The overall benefit of the activity influences risk. So if I think the activity is beneficial, it decreases my perception of risk. So it just makes me think it's probably actually only moderate risk instead of a high risk, even though the risk doesn't change no matter what. The risk is the risk is the risk. My perception of it doesn't change the reality. So this is a key line out of The Limit of Expertise. I highly encourage every pilot to read it. It looks at a lot of famous historical mishaps, and it kind of takes away the limitations that the NTSB has when they make their final report, and it kind of talks about it in language that's like, hey, this is probably what happened, but like we can't say that as the NTSB because we have to have definite factual information. So it's much more conversational. Situations that in many ways resemble previous encounters, but which differ subtly in critical aspects. This is what really gets pilots in trouble. This is what happened to that C-130 doing the firefighting mission. They made one drop. It was subtly different, but they didn't recognize it, and they tried to make a second drop, and they were pushed down into the earth. So what is the safety margin? The safety margin is the difference between the task demand and the aircraft or air crew's capabilities. From a weather perspective, this is an understanding of certification, right? And the actual performance, like tailwind and crosswind performance. You've got something published in your book that tells you you can accept these limitations. So anytime you get close to the limit of an aircraft, you reduce the safety margin because the aircraft isn't capable of performing outside of that area. So if I land with no wind versus landing with the max crosswind limitation of the aircraft, I have no more safety margin in that parameter. Service ceilings, approach minima, braking actions, right? Pilot training and experience. This is a lot harder for us to kind of contextualize in the same way we look at all of the other hard numbers associated with the aircraft. But pilots' proficiency and capacity to anticipate, detect, and correct issues. This is directly tied to threat and error management. If I don't know what's out there, I can't say this is likely to happen to me, so I can't plan an escape because I just don't realize I'm bumbling up against something that's potentially hazardous. So to revisit the two types of weather decisions, the tactical, it's really easy for a pilot to make a can-I decision. Because if the aircraft's out of crosswind limitations, I can't do it. If it's in crosswind limitations, I can do it. If the approach minima exists, I can do it. If it doesn't exist, I can't do it. The cans are relatively simple for us as pilots. As we start making our way over those personal limits, the I'm safe impacts, performance variability, which is the idea that a pilot, the world's greatest pilot, can screw up the next radio call, the next landing, the next takeoff, the next whatever. For any reason, I can screw up my next thing that I do as a pilot. And then proficiency in training, then we get all the way to strategic, which again for us is kind of that, what I'm allowed to do in order to save a life. Well, as I move from tactical to strategic, I rely much more heavily on judgment. But the problem with relying on judgment is that it's very variable. So I can have plan continuation bias, right? That's that idea that I said I was going to go to this airport, and every 0.1 nautical miles I get closer to that airport, the harder it is for me to decide to divert. And there's tons of evidence that supports that. The risk perception errors, which we've already talked about. Incomplete information, which is where if I don't know where to look for weather, or if I'm not getting accurate weather information, well, that's going to build into my judgment. External pressure, workload, time pressure, ambiguous cues, and overconfidence. I want to talk about overconfidence because a lot of people think they walk to the aircraft with this just strut, like nothing's going to get me. And I will tell you that generally is not the case anymore. And it's certainly not the case for most professional aviation organizations because it's identified and stomped out pretty quickly. Overconfidence is more so, I think I landed in something like this last week and I was pretty okay, right? It's the overconfidence in yourself to do the thing because you don't necessarily recognize that you're a little sleepier today. The visibility is a little reduced today. The winds are actually more of a tailwind than a headwind. The lighting at the airport is a little bit different. It's failing to take in all of those little variables and thinking that you're going to be just as good as you were the last time you did it. All right, so then what's judgment? There's a lot of definitions, but if I had to paraphrase, I would say that it's the ability to develop options and then take the most favorable action based on an estimation of the outcome. I got to look at the whole situation and go, all right, I could go, I could delay, or I could not go. If I'm flying, I could continue, I could abort, or I could divert, and then how I do that. Well, it is impossible to have the judgment you need to make a weather decision if you don't have a deeper understanding of how weather itself impacts your risk. So how does noise impact organizations? And I think this was a conversation we had offline at some point. So judgment requires us to accept that well-trained pilots are going to come up with slightly different answers to the question. Maybe one pilot decides to hold, maybe one pilot decides to divert, maybe one pilot decides to slow down and wait for the wind shift, who knows. But we all agree that it should fall within a somewhat of kind of a bounded expectation. Well, noise occurs when pilots who we'd expect to agree make meaningfully different decisions. All the pilots that are in front of me are saying, yeah, you know what, I don't want to try this. And I'm like, clear me for the approach, right? Like that is an example of how judgment is very different amongst pilots in an organization. And the truth is it exists way more than we want to give it credit for. But it exists because it's like a leak in our basement. We don't really know it's there, so we tolerate it. It's not like we know Justin's going to do something completely different than everyone else, because if we did, we'd address it. It's the fact that we don't realize Justin's going to do something completely different because we don't talk about this stuff, we don't train for it, we don't see it. All right, so I want you to tell me, just raise your hand. I'm not going to ask you to tell me about the aircraft because sometimes I think that gets people not to participate. But I want you to tell me who recognizes these call signs. American 351. Okay? November 5, Juliet Fox. All right? American 539. No takers. What about Eastern 902? Okay? What about Finnair 105? This next one, if you know, you're going to know. Flying Tiger 161. Nothing? What about US Air 984? Cool. Who recognizes these call signs? Delta 191. Who recognizes Eastern 66? Who recognizes US Air 1016? The call signs that almost nobody remembered, took off, landed, or were right in front of or behind the accident aircraft. Right? These are all the luckiest pilots in the world because they got away with it. So what that translates to is what we call local rationality. Given the information that was actually available to the crew, it seems likely that many or even most crews in this situation would have continued the approach for at least as long as the accident crew before deciding on a missed approach. This is talking about US Air 1016. Local rationality is the concept. When I was asking Paul, was there anything that would have told that pilot it was stratus to the south? No. So all of us probably would have done exactly what that pilot did. Well, what this boils down to is the fact that if we want pilots to have better common sense, we have to have better common knowledge. We cannot rely on them just intuiting the information out of thin air at that moment. We have to train it into them. So how do regs and policies factor in? So regulations and policies are administrative tools meant to frame operational risk management, but they're always written for the ideal, and they're not really applicable for the real deal every time. So these are an absolute necessary evil. You cannot have individual pilots or organizations or the whole national airspace just doing whatever the hell it wants. We have to have regs. Well, at best case, they're going to provide a set of guiding principles to the pilots. But you have to ask, is what you're putting in place too loose or is it too restrictive? Well, is there flexibility built in or do pilots have to find workarounds? Because I guarantee you a pilot will find a workaround for any regulation you put in place. Is it ambiguous or conflicting across references? If I look at the FAR, or I look at my local SOP, or I look at my airlines thing, are we saying the same thing? Is it cohesive, right? And if it's not, a significant issue exists. Does the leadership unintentionally incentivize non-compliance? Military is very easy to see this. Hey, so-and-so did what? Are you kidding me? Yeah, but he's getting an award. Well, shit. I guess that's what the leadership actually wants me to do, because the regulation says never do this, but we're standing at an award ceremony where this person did it, and they're getting medals pinned in their chest. So organizations can unintentionally promote the wrong thing just through recognition. And then, does the organization consistently enforce a standard? Hey, we don't really like Justin, so every time he gets kind of near men's, we're going to have a conversation. Zach's our golden child. We're going to kind of let that slide. Is it being consistently enforced? Because that sends the message. And then, do they become tools for micromanagement? The worst thing you can do to a pilot is try to micromanage. We're going to find workarounds. We hate it. The whole reason we're pilots is we want to leave all the other people in the world behind. We just want to fly around, mind our own business, and enjoy what we're doing. So here's a perfect example. This is from our regulation that says all flights shall avoid thunderstorms. And the language for the Coast Guard shall is not like a may, maybe, if you want. It's like an absolute no joke. But here's the problem. This crew was put in a place where it was not possible to fly around the weather due to Mexican and Cuban airspace boundaries. So the Coast Guard says, don't go there. But because you have this mission that's here and there's weather there, a crew that had no other alternative but try to get through that. They were put into a spot where all they had to do was come back. They couldn't go. It's a military aircraft. You can't just blunder into someone else's airspace unless it's an emergency. They had declared an emergency, and they had a pretty significantly expensive lightning strike. All right, well, that brings up the enforcement paradox, right? So here's the mean days of thunderstorms. This is where we're all kind of living here. If I was to work for Delta or Southwest as a pilot, and I went around or held every time a thunderstorm was 20 miles within 20 miles of the airport, how long do you think I would work for Delta or Southwest? Don't answer it, but I think we understand the point. If you're a survivor down here in the panhandle of Florida, and it's summertime, do you want me avoiding every thunderstorm by 20 miles, or do you want me trying to come and rescue you, right? I have to be able to enforce the regulations in a way that doesn't send mixed signals and still keeps crews safe. That's a very difficult thing, because I'll tell you, as we've all pointed out, it's impossible to apply the truly appropriate conservative guidance of thunderstorm avoidance by 20 miles or 10 miles to an environment like we operate in. So as leaders, how are we choosing to enforce the way our crews or our individual pilots are going through and doing their job? So let's talk a little bit about proficiency versus familiarity. The first picture is me flying up in Boston. Anybody know what that is? Convective roll cloud, right, of the outflow boundary of a significant set of thunderstorms that's going on in there, right? Again, if you take a picture of something because it's interesting to you, do not fly into it. Stay very far away. My co-pilot was like, oh, that's so cool, let's go check it out. He's like, I don't know what that is, but I know it's bad. Let's just not go there. Here is runway 15 at Mobile, about to taxi and take off for Hurricane Ida, right? So you can't really even see the taxi lights directly in front of us, but we had congressmen that needed to go, so let's V1 rotate, right? Here is Cape Cod in the winter. The point I'm trying to make here is I can get proficiency in winter flying. I can get proficiency in avoiding thunderstorms in the summer. I probably should not have proficiency in flying in thunderstorms, and I probably shouldn't have a lot of proficiency unless I'm a hurricane hunter of flying in hurricanes. So how do I prepare myself to survive an inadvertent encounter with seriously hazardous weather if I can never gain proficiency? Well, we have to increase our academic knowledge. We have to know academically what's going on. And then I can become very proficient at flying around, looking at all the products before I take off, assessing the thunderstorms with airborne weather radar, and making a good decision without ever going into that bad weather. So this is how we can get, close to the bad stuff and prepare ourselves for the eventuality that we might be in without actually violating any sort of safety or legal rules. All right, so weather products and services, we've talked a tremendous amount about that today and yesterday. These are kind of the 4 rules that I need pilots to live by. Number 1, understand that all weather products are old. I don't care what it is. Unless it's airborne weather radar that's scanning directly in front of you right this second, or your eyeball that's looking at the thunderstorm or the tornado or whatever it is, everything that has been issued by anybody in the world is old. How old it is going to be a function of the timestamp. So we always need to be looking at the timestamps for our weather products. Next, always find a legend. I feel like I shouldn't have to tell people that, but when we point out 256 colors of one scale that gets down to here, that gets down to that, and then red's used for moisture over here, and it's used for, something else over here. If I'm not accessing the legend every time I use a product, even if I feel really confident that I know what the product is, I'm probably missing some of the information. It's been mentioned a couple times, pilots need to look for trends, not the details. I don't know how many times I've flown on something where everything said it was going to stop at the North Georgia line. Like, it's just awful, but it recognizes the border and it doesn't want to go to North Carolina. And pilots are like, oh, cool, well, we'll just fly in North Carolina and we're going to be okay. And I'm like, let's try, right? Because we're not going to kill us, but I want you to see the mistake of looking at the detail of North Georgia as the line. And sure enough, it's pushed up halfway into almost West Virginia, right? Because the models can't really tell you the street that it's going to start or stop on. And then never decide on a single product. Paul did an excellent job of kind of showing us some of the limitations of that. And this is going to lead us into kind of what makes good weather decisions. Right? So number 1, we have to understand the basic science and the TTP about weather phenomena. The basic science. I'm not asking pilots to understand a rear inflow jet. I am asking pilots to know that a bow echo is a place we don't want to be anywhere near, right? It doesn't take a lot of understanding to look at that and go, yeah, I don't want to do that. We have to know weather products and services, their strengths, their limitations, what exists, where to access it, that they're all old. We have to know the human factors and risk management flaws that we as pilots can bring into the decision-making process. We have to analyze mishaps to figure out what went wrong, but equally, we need to look at what goes right. And last, if you haven't, you need to become proficient with airborne weather radar. That's not always available to every pilot, but if it is, it needs to be a tool that you focus on as much as you focus on your EFB or your iPad. And again, we're all susceptible, and I think Paul did an excellent job pointing this out. So this is mostly a recognition of the fact that any one of us is susceptible to this on any given flight. On the left, a 312-hour pilot who unfortunately perished, killing himself and a family member. And on the right was US Air 1016, a combination of 21,000 hours on that crew. And they both made a similar decision. There's a lot of other nuance to it in context, but both individual pilot or crew were able to put themselves in a position that the aircraft couldn't recover from. All right, so let's transition now to what Justin would do if he was weather king for a day. This is just brainstorming, right? So what I want you to know is this is more about like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if? I realize there's some probably limitations. Number 1, it's from a pilot's point of view, so some of you might laugh. I like to consider this as me being the good idea fairy over here and trying to solve problems. So inside the Coast Guard, I would like to provide routine weather education touch points with scenario-based and real-world examples. A lot of times we look at mishaps and we already know the outcome. So it's really easy for a crew or a student to distance themselves from, whatever, that's what that crew did. But if you lead them down the primrose path, you deliver the weather products, you give them a mission, you have them make these decision points, you find that local rationality, a lot of them are making similar decisions as the accident crew. So scenario-based decisions are integral. That's the ultimate goal. Next, we should develop area-specific in-flight training syllabi. If you're new to Mobile, I should teach you how to fly around and look at the Gulf Coast thunderstorm convective activity, right? Like an IP who's been doing this for a while, instructor pilot who's been doing it for a while, should take you around and show you the weather. Well, there should be evidence-based area-specific kneeboard cards, like, hey, understand that the tip dew point spread normally is 2 what we look for, but over here, because it's, sea fog and that we could have issues where, like, the salt content provides that condensation, whatever it is, right? Like, give me something that's specific to the area that I fly in that helps me translate big weather, philosophy to local weather flying. Improve full motion simulator weather and weather radar fidelity. It's so frustrating when I try to train pilots on the use of airborne weather radar and they sweep back and forth and it's red, it's just magenta everywhere, and I'm like, okay, I promise you it would look like this is what the storm, it doesn't help. So if my simulators are accurate, then my actual real world decision makings will be better. Partner with weather experts, that's what we're trying to do here, because again, I don't know how to do this stuff, I rely on y'all. And then require weather to be an evaluated subject. Zach's probably going to slash my tires. Require weather to be an evaluated subject throughout an aviator's entire career, because doers do what checkers check. And if you don't test me on this, I'm probably not going to spend my time getting smarter on it. All right, outside the Coast Guard. Everything, please God, in plain language. I don't want to translate a single thing for the rest of my life. If we've got watches that can make the translations for me, we're probably at a point in time where everything can be just straight, plain language, right? I would love you forever if we were able to do that. I would love an easier look-back capability. I know the amount of effort it takes for you guys to present just that information, like, hey, we found this product, and this was on this, and this is over there, because that paints the big picture. I'm going to quit way before that, and, I shouldn't have to, right? So it would be great if I could go date, time, and location, whether it's a grid or a station identifier. And it would be so nice if all of the data that was associated with that was centralized. So I could go, boom, I want to see the TAF, I want to see the METAR, I want to see the surface analysis, all of that stuff right there, instead of having to go to 50 different websites, a lot of which are universities who are just doing this stuff because it's part of their curriculum and it's helping with that. Access to research repositories. What I mean by that is the paywall sites. I can't tell you how many times in the process of trying to put together good training, I've found the title of an article in an abstract that was phenomenal. And it was like $375 for this PDF. I'm like, yeah, I'll just ask John at the National Weather Service. I'm not going to do this. So if we had a .gov website where trusted individuals vetted the research that was kind of coming out and said, this is an incredible study, this should be something that's accessible to everybody, that would really cut down on the ability for me to kind of be able to get to the information that really matters. So a personalized, centralized website, and I know she's not here now, but I know the Aviation Weather Center is working on it. What I would really love is, instead of having to go to SPC for this, and Weather Prediction Center for that, and AWC for this, and National Weather for that, it would be awesome if I could go to one website and then like live link to the product. So if there's 15 products that I always use when I make my daily decisions, no matter who owns them, I would like to be able to go to that, click on it, and it takes me to that live document. It would just make it so much easier to synthesize the information when I don't have 4 favorites that I have to click into, and then drop down menus, and then days and times, right? So if I had the ability to just quickly go, yeah, these are my 5 convective products, radar and satellite, these are the 6 I use, and update that, and it's all personal. This is probably the thing that I would want the absolute most, and you kind of touched on it before. Integrated product backgrounds. So the example here is, this is just a BS product, right? But if there was a button I could click that popped up and said, hey, this product is designed to communicate, claiming clear language. This product is designed to communicate the likelihood of icing intensity, whatever, right? It is made through the use of automated documentation only. There's no human augmentation, or it's got human augmentation, or whatever. So now I know, yeah, this is just a computer, right? Or, Bob has looked at this and made a difference. I would like to know where the data comes from. This comes from satellite coverage, or ASOS data, or data from aircraft, or radio splints, or whatever. Who cares? I would like to know where it comes from. Historical accuracy. I know products are assessed for accuracy. I would like to know if all products are. And if they're not, tell me about it. Because if it's not assessed for accuracy and it's automated, it probably isn't something that I should give a lot of credit to in a complex weather decision. What other products would you recommend I use this with? How can I chain this together with something else to get a better idea of what's going on? I'd love disclaimers. Hey, understand that this product may lie to you because of X, Y, or Z. It might mislead you because if it's showing, cloud coverage, it might be getting the highest level of clouds, and it might not actually matter to you because, as you said, you mentioned at 10,000 feet, who cares, right? Because that's where you're at. But if the weather product tells you how it can mislead you, then it's less likely to mislead you. I would love links to short videos explaining the products, like just conversationally, and then kind of links describing how to use it. It's like that scenario-based decision making. It would be really awesome if a trained meteorologist were to go, hey, this is this day, I want to show you how this product works, this is where I got the information, because now I can put it together myself. So here's some great examples. AWC put together a how to use an icing forecast, and it's got a couple of pages that talk about like what information exists, where it is, what the difference is, and then it actually lists, what I love is FAA legal interpretation letters. So this is the FAA's like lawyers saying this is how we interpret our own regulations. So you as a pilot interpret it any differently, you're wrong. It's still not great because it's just written and it's kind of hidden, but at least it exists. The GFA is a phenomenal product. There's a lot of information out there about how to use it, but it's changing. And as we talked about the other day, there's no current tutorials about how to do it. So anything that you can do that's interactive, particularly with a younger generation of pilots who are not as maybe inclined to go and find the information themselves because they're used to it being spoon-fed through TikTok, that could probably help get the information out better. I would love weather-focused accident analysis, right? So the NTSB's meteorological information portion of accidents is excellent, right? And if you ever are a pilot that's interested, they do everything that he talked about today. They list, hey, was a convective signet in place at the time? Was this in place? What pilot? That's great. But this is an example from the National Weather Service that's talking about Delta 191. And what I really love about it is it's got like the actual data, there's conversations, like what was going on, that the weather forecasters themselves didn't even think that the cells were that significant, so why the heck were their pilots? Like anything that we can do to focus the accident analysis specifically on weather and not just, oh, it was also low ceilings and this. This is it. This is my number one because I fly at 200 feet with my ramp open all the time, and I have other pilots that hover at 35 feet with people dangling off wires. I would love a microburst potential chart or something, right? So examples, right? So here's obviously the SPC. If you were able to tell me that the environmental lapse rate and the mid-level moisture content, whatever the heck the 30-something variables that John showed me on his tracker, like if you could say that, hey, it's probably not likely you'll get a microburst today, that would help me a lot. Ideally, all pilots should be looking at it going, that could swap me out of the sky, right? All right, so how do we teach weather better? That's kind of how we wrap this all up. Specifically, as an instructor pilot, that's what I'm always focused on. So number one is we want to focus on the practical instead of the technical. For meteorologists, it is all practical. It's highly technical, but that is required. That's how you put it into play. As a pilot, I don't necessarily need to understand the mechanics of like elevated convection. I know John was talking to me about it one day, and I was like, is it bad? He's like, it could be. I'm like, okay, that's what I need. Right? So we need to focus on the practical. How can I put this to use before, in pre-flight, or in flight? That's what I need to know. Whenever a flight is canceled for weather, we should use the time to talk about the weather that's responsible. You've already scheduled to fly. You've already allotted that period of time. So why not go, dang, I couldn't fly today because of weather. Let me crack open a book, look at a YouTube video, go to an aviation weather website, and read kind of the legends and just get smarter. So use the time that you were going to fly to get better at understanding it. So have students research weather-related cases, getting into the details, not just the Wikipedia summary. I mean, Wikipedia is a great place to start when you go microburst accidents, and it lists like however many hundred, and you go to the tail numbers. But then you need to be getting into like the actual NTSB data, the docket data, whatever else is available. All right, this is huge. Treating similar but safer conditions as if they're more severe. how I like to do this as a pilot is, let's say we're about to take off and there is a thunderstorm 10 miles away. I'll always brief the crew, hey guys, the storm's 10 miles away, probably not going to impact us, but we're going to treat it as if it was right over the field and we had to take off. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pre-brief the wind shear escape. So now we all know that that's how we would do it. I am going to delay my rotation to get a little bit of extra speed, understanding that it's going to consume a little bit more of the runway. Whatever it is, your TTP, use those soft trigger points to become harder trigger points. Because if you're always thinking about it every time you see a thunderstorm or every time icing is in the forecast, you think about what the TAFs are for the airports along the route of flight or the freezing levels so you know if you can descend out of it. If you're always thinking about it, when you wake up at 2 a.m. and you're exhausted and you have to go, or you're finishing a long day of work and you're about to fly to, visit family and you're kind of off your game, you will have built the habits to put in practice then that you want when it's really, really bad. All right, regularly discuss go, delay, and a no-go or continue abort divert criteria. If you're a single pilot, this is where having a trusted friend to call and be like, hey, I think we were having this conversation yesterday, right? Hey, this is what I'm thinking about doing. I haven't really flown in a while. Let's kind of look at scopes. What do you think? Just bounce that idea off. And if you don't have somebody that you can routinely call or it's kind of off hours, have the conversation out loud. All right, Justin, what am I going to do if? What would I go for? What would I not go for? Saying it out loud, kind of getting into that habit. This kind of brings into explaining how you're making your decisions, right? As an instructor pilot, students are going to mimic what I do until they understand what I do. And if they don't understand what I do, they're going to mimic what I do even when it's inappropriate. So I have to explain why I'm making the decision that I'm making. And equally important, what would change my mind. Because if I tell somebody, hey, this is safe to go, and I don't explain when it would not be safe to go, they're going to look at a similar situation in the future and go, well, Justin said it was good to go, and not realize that I said, well, hey, I said it was safe to go because even though the lightning is started, the echo tops are at 25,000 feet. That's significantly different than a multi-cluster storm with 40,000 foot tops, right? So, hey, if we get out to the aircraft and the tops are at 40,000 feet, I ain't going, or 30,000 feet, I'm not going, right? So not only am I telling you how I'm making my decision, I'm giving you specific criteria to know when I would change my mind. All right, constructively expose students to weather in training so they're prepared for operations. For us, this is, hey, on a day where it's just going to be it's convective, but it's not precipitating. It's kind of just capped. It's not going anywhere. I might choose to route myself through that light to moderate turbulence because I know there's no embedded hazards other than that. With an easy out, I can climb up, I can go left or right. So that way, my co-pilot understands what it feels like to be in the aircraft in light to moderate turbulence. So they can still run a checklist or an emergency procedure if it happens to them. Because the first time you go through this should not be when you actually need to use it. How you choose to do that is going to be very much based on regulation and your organization and your own personal limits. All right, this is probably the most important. That's why I did that, to emphasize how important it was. Guys, we cannot cry wolf. It is so easy to have conversations that are doom and gloom about weather that pilots either turn off, tune it out, they just ignore you, or they are so scared they don't want to ever go, right? But what I mean by crying wolf is I understand that an updraft in a thunderstorm can reach 10 or 12,000 feet per minute. I understand that. But I'm probably also going to know not to go in the storm that's that capable of producing that updraft. What I need to understand is what the average, like what's the common, what altitudes for where I fly, are likely. What likelihood is there to have the hazard actually happen? Like hail, we talked about Key West. Hail is just what you do to get a cat, right? Like it doesn't actually apply to Key West. So if we're always having these doom and gloom conversations, you actually lose the pilot core that you're trying to talk to. Right? We need to be able to say, yes, this can happen to you, and here's a case study to illustrate it, but more likely than not, this is kind of what you're going to experience. And what that does is it builds that confidence, and it doesn't give pilots these rules that they violate for their whole career, and then they stop caring about it. And on the day when a meteorologist tells me I'm not giving you my initials, you better freaking believe that I'm not going. All right? So, to finish, what I really want to emphasize, because there's so much information out there, is that all the information I can get on my cell phone right now is 100,000 times more powerful than what put man on the moon. Right? So there is absolutely no reason for a pilot not to know. However, there are some very legitimate challenges that I'd like us to try to work through. All right, so thank you again. I know this is the very end of your weekend. Sincerely appreciate it. Any questions or feedback from me? Anything that you thought I got wrong? Anything I got right? Anything I thought I'm missing? Where am I on the right path? I'd be happy to talk with you after. I don't want to hold everybody else, but if you have questions, this is the stuff I love talking about. So if you want to connect or spam me, that's my Coast Guard email address. The QR code is my LinkedIn. So if you want to get together, talk about it, this is what I'm here to try to do. So thank you very much.